Right. Good evening, one and all. Thank you all for being so adventurous this evening. We've lost a few to the trains, and I'm told that anybody on Southwest has got a interesting, perhaps other lines, an interesting journey home. Right, there are no trains at all at the moment, at least on Lara and my line. So we might be having an all-nighter if we really get going. Right, so this is a topic that is, my name is James Croft, and I'm the director of the Centre for Education Economics. We have been operating, indeed we actually began in this building in early 2012. For those of you who don't know us, which I think actually is quite a number this evening, which is good to see. We began in 2012, so we're going a few years now. And we essentially were founded in order to bring economic perspective to the policy debate. We feel that whilst education economics increasingly has a shaping role on policy, if that's the way to put it, it is little understood in the context of the wider discussion about education in public policy. And so we've made it our business to try to bring to the fore and get under the noses of the people that make decisions the really rigorous research that's coming out of a new, exciting and burgeoning field of literature. We do that in a number of ways through what we hope are more readily reviews and pieces of research than you will commonly find, or certainly they are, than the academics themselves will tend to produce. We also do that through events like these to try to open up and give understanding more broadly, and through the media, and also through a monthly research digest. So we take an unashamedly discipline-focused, discipline-based view of education issues, which is important, because when we come to a subject such as this one, where we have plenty of people that are very, very heavily involved and very passionately committed to serving children with peculiar needs, it's important to understand where we're coming from in putting forward this research. So we try to give people understanding of the difference between an empirical research experiment and other approaches to conducting research, which doubtless we will get into discussion of this evening. So the role of targeted education programs in stimulating higher achievement among gifted children is a hotly debated topic, as we all know, and opinion polarizes when this is raised. People will either give a look at it or they won't, as has been my experience when trying to deal with media today. This sort of fracture of opinion within education circles is perhaps no more so than in England, where more than a decade of concerted effort by governments, beginning with Blair in the late 90s and through the 2000s, has only intensified dispute about who should qualify, how you define it, those that should qualify when funding is limited, and it's also served to increase tensions around the equity agenda. Yet, successor governments, partly by way of response, have honed in on the progress of low-performing pupils especially, and the needs of gifted pupils therefore have been put to one side. Now, in that we know that high-performing pupils contribute disproportionately to countries' economic growth, this, in our view, seems short-sighted. And when one considers the wider context in which we presently find ourselves, one way or another, Brexit will soon be decided. It's going to become clear how, in the wider context of global trade, things are going to play out economically for us. There's going to be a different set of priorities in every area, but it's pretty clear that investment in human capital is going to figure prominently across all these areas. The lethargy to which people, and the reluctance to which people bring to this question and engaging with this human capital argument is, well, to say the least, short-sighted and in some ways quite worrying. So we believe the economic case for seeking to improve provision in this area is compelling, and Gabriel will be speaking to that, and then beyond why we think gifted education still has potential that we should be pressing in to try to realise. He'll be speaking to that in just a moment. So it's a good time, we think, to consider how far we can be clear about what, if anything, works in gifted education. I'm delighted to welcome this evening three family members, so to speak, of our esteemed outfit. They bring all the esteem.
Not esteem, not family member.
Yeah, that's right. In addition to Gabriel, my colleague here, who I'll introduce in a moment, we're pleased to have Deborah Eyre with us, Professor Deborah Eyre. Deborah may well be known to some of you as the founder of High Performance Learning, which is an advanced pedagogy helping schools become world-class. It says on the ticket, through systematically developing superior cognitive performance in all students. She has a background in gifted and talented education. As I frequently discover whenever I read Deborah's extensive biography, that she has a background in just pretty much everything, actually. But this area is no exception. She was director of the UK government's innovative National Academy for Gifted and Talented Youth, based at the University of Warwick, which doubts will be known to you. And she is also a widely published author in this field. Her book, Able Children in Ordinary Schools, published in 1997, is still held as a seminal text and still in publication. Also, we have Professor Daniel Regis, who is, like Tim Oates, sitting next to him, has been a faithful and very helpful advisor to us on our academic council over several years. Daniel is now head of research at Ofsted, but prior to this, when we knew him first, he was Associate Dean of Research and Enterprise, Faculty of Social, Human and Mathematical Sciences, and Professor of Education in Southampton Education School at the University of Southampton, where he remains a visiting professor. Tim Oates, CBE. See, I've left off the professor. I was talking to someone earlier about my tendency to be very consistent with these things. Is Group Director of Assessment Research and Development at Cambridge Assessment, and he leads a 40-strong research team focusing on national and international research, advises governments around the world, and is particularly known for his work on the review of the national primary curriculum in England. which came off the back of an initiative of his own, publishing Could Do Better, which provided the principles for that undertaking. So, it's a family affair, but hopefully it won't be too much of a bun fight. That is my wish. So can I ask that I'm going to actually try, when I come to the chairing part, when we come through all of our, somewhat unusually for us to try to keep our questions and comments from the floor terse, so we can get as many of you in as possible, and also restrained. Good. Okay. Well, thank you. So, Gabriel. Gabriel, my colleague, is lead economist here at the Centre for Education and Economics, and he's affiliated research at the Research Institute of Industrial Economics in Stockholm. He's also a PhD student at the London School of Economics, and he's published widely, a lot with us, but all over the place. So I'm delighted to have this fruit of his recent labours to listen to. Now, do you want to stay there and then come up when we get to the panel bit? Yeah, good. Okay, great. It's all yours now, Gabriel.
Great.
And
thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming to listen to me. I'm not sure we're going to be able to solve the issue of Brexit today, as James alluded to, but maybe we can get a little bit closer of how we can make it a success as we are on our way out. What works in gifted education? I'll just speak for 15 minutes, 17 minutes, not going to torture you for too long. Outlining the paper and a couple of policy conclusions that I draw on. Just to highlight one thing, when we talk about gifted education, there's often a distinction made between gifted and talented in the English policy context. Gifted being academically gifted, talented pupils being those who are high performing in various practical skills such as music. I will be talking mostly or solely about gifted education in an academic sense, and that's simply because there's very little convincing research on practical skills. So have that in mind. Some of the policy conclusions are still relevant for the other kids, and we will come to that. Just a little bit of background to start with. As James highlighted, the role of targeted education programs in stimulating higher achievement among gifted kids is obviously a fiercely debated topic. An argument that is often made in the policy debate is that high ability pupils are not appropriately challenged in mainstream English schools. In 2013, for example, also found a discouraging picture of what it means to be one of the most able students in non-selective secondary schools in England. In general, it's pretty clear that while there have been, I think it was a change in 2014, so Ofsted now focus a little bit more on the needs of able students as well. Generally speaking, the needs of gifted children as such have not been high on the agenda. This is the case all over the world. This exception being if it's in a social mobility perspective. So if you are disadvantaged and you are gifted, then you're on the agenda. If you're gifted as such, you're not necessarily there. There are good reasons for this, because countries have focused a lot on decreasing gaps and increasing equity, and more generally increasing the share of kids who reach the basic skills that they need to have in order to survive in society. But the consequences of not enabling gifted kids specifically to reach their potential could be severe. As James alluded, research suggests that high-performing pupils contribute disproportionately to economic growth. And this is basically seen here. This graph basically shows the relationship between the share of top-performing students in various international tests and the annual per capita growth rate between 1960 and 2000. This is holding constant initial GDP per capita and the share of pupils who reach basic skills. What you find is that it's a much stronger relationship between the share of top-performing students than the share of pupils who reach basic skills and economic growth. It doesn't mean that it's not. Sorry, is that around? What happened?
carry on.
Okay. And it doesn't mean that there are obviously complementarities between these two groups. The research suggests that there are complementarities. So obviously you need a highly skilled based population that can implement the innovations that rocket scientists have come up with. But in general, it shows the importance of actually of focusing on trying to improve the possibilities for able kids in England and elsewhere. Just a little bit of theory to understand where we're coming from and where the research, the empirical research is coming from. Why do we think that gifted education programs would make a difference? Well, at a very fundamental level, it is that we believe that some believe at least, that high ability children need different types of instruction or environments in order to succeed. And in this sense, the kind of basic type of gifted education is to put them into a separate classroom or a separate school. So streaming or ability grouping is often important. It doesn't have to be. You can also have tiered instruction within the classroom. But it's often a kind of a key issue in this field, which makes the content, the differential content, possible. And that content is often based, not always, but often based on various combinations of acceleration, basically pushing through the kids, taking the curriculum fast and a faster pace, and enrichment, which basically means that should they go into greater depth into the different subjects, and also a greater extent. So they often or they're often allowed to study things that normally allowed to do. There are various things here, curriculum modifications, but it tends to be an emphasis on increased complexity of ideas, more open-ended problem solving, and also a couple of instruction modifications, more independence in completion of tasks, less detail in presentation of content, greater choice, etc. So it's basically trying to make them take a more difficult and rigorous curriculum and do it a bit faster, and often with a sense of kind of discovery-based learning. That's the kind of theoretical framework for it anyway. But it's not clear, and this is important, it is not clear whether gifted pupils actually need a different environment. This is an empirical question. And it's also not clear, even if they do need a different environment, it's not clear that the total impact of putting them in that environment would be positive. And that's simply because the environment interacts with other things. Or the environment is obviously, for example, peers. That's part of the environment. But when you change the environment, you take some kids out of the classroom, you also change the peer groups. And I have another paper looking at the research on peer effects, and it's incredibly difficult to predict how peers affect different kids. We presume that high ability pupils necessarily are good to be surrounded by. That's not necessarily the case at all. In some cases, actually better to be best. So depending on how you change the peer groups, you may actually see no impact overall, even if they do need other types of instruction. Okay. It's also not clear whether we can even accurately identify gifted pupils. So due to regression to the mean, which basically just means that in any given test, high achievers, low achievers, they tend to revert to the mean over time. And because of differential growth rates of different kids, some people learn faster than others. The majority of pupils who perform in the top percentiles in any given test no longer do so in a couple of years. And this is obviously very difficult because it means that some children who would have been classified as gifted a couple of years later and may benefit from these changes would not be able to get that type of teaching or instruction. And it also may mean that some kids who were deemed to be gifted actually are not gifted. It was just because of this measurement error in the test that they were deemed to be gifted, and they're basically losing out because they were subjected to an environment they will not benefit from. This doesn't mean that all children necessarily will fall down the distribution, and there are certain ways we can improve the identification process, but it highlights the importance of identification and that it is a crucial problem, because if we can't identify the gifted kids, it's a bit of a moot point whether or not they need different types of instruction in different environments. Okay. Turning to the literature, just one point about this literature, and a couple of methodological considerations that guided my review. I tried to look at pretty much all research, but I focus specifically on research that is quasi-experimental or experimental. And the reason for that is that there's always a problem in education research or in social scientific research. Is correlation, does it imply causation? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And in this specific field, it's very crucial that you get around this problem, the selection problem, because children who are deemed to be gifted, by definition, tend to perform higher than children who are not deemed to be gifted, regardless of what type of program they attend. And that's why it's absolutely crucial to go to use quasi-experimental research or randomized studies that get around this problem by basically evening out selection problems across the treatment group and the control group. Those who get this type of treatment basically going through the gifted education program that you're interested in, and those who do not. And unfortunately, the empirical research on gifted programs overall has been very poor in terms of the ability to separate the impact of the actual program from the impact of just being a smart kid. Because if you're a smart kid, you're going to probably learn more anyway. And this is from a couple of researchers a couple of years ago who suggested that the bulk of the research in gifted education is descriptive. So a lot of it is actually not even looking at correlations, but just looking at either before, after, or just describing a program and observing some kids, how they interact. And that's all good and well. And it might give you an indication and a hypothesis for whether or not this works. But it cannot be the end all it can't be the answer to whether or not that's the case. And the researchers concluded that the lack of causal research leaves the field with considerable ambiguity about ethical practices in general. Moreover, this is the general story, but in the past couple of years, we've seen a couple of more studies coming out. Some of them are from economists, but some of them are also for educationalists who have been more interested in running trials and doing various experimental, cross-experimental studies. Unfortunately, that evidence is not that informative, in that it doesn't suggest that gifted education programs or school-level streaming, or streaming in general, on average make much difference in terms of generating performance among gifted children. So this, I mean, we've been talking a lot about grammar schools, of course, and it's a hot topic in this country all the time. And my reading of the evidence, look, it's not a big deal because it's not going to do that much. It's not going to make much difference to those kids, even who are able to attend these schools. There is some evidence from the 1950s in one specific district of the UK that some of these kids, only girls, benefited in terms of having higher income decades later. That was by an impact on fertility. Most of the evidence, stronger evidence, larger evidence from America, from Canada, from all across the developed world does not suggest that this is a big deal from that point of view. The developing world is slightly different, but we are in the developed world, so I emphasize that research a bit more. When it comes to these kind of specific programs, focusing on gifted, this kind of differential, trying to provide differential content guided by the theory I just mentioned, that's pretty much the same on average. And most of this research, again, it's American and it's European. We know very little about the specific programs in East Asia or in other parts of the world. And again, the couple of studies, we're not talking about many, but there are some, and what I'm trying to find was a pattern of the studies that are rigorous. What do they look like? What do they find in terms of the type of program that is effective? And it seemed to be the case that targeted enrichment programs, this kind of in-depth, making the curriculum more rigorous, more difficult, combined with self-directed instruction, do have positive effects. So this kind of, if you like, discovery-based learning. Now, an example of this was in Holland. where a couple of researchers looked specifically at one school in the beginning, and then they ran a larger randomized trial where they allowed gifted pupils, determined by a specific two tests, one non-cognitive and one cognitive. They were basically 25% top in the first school and 18% top of the performance in the other schools. They were allowed to replace at least 2 hours of instruction per week and instead pursue their own self-selected projects, with the school providing facilities, special teachers acting as coaches, and so on. And these studies found very significant positive effects on these children, both in terms of the results at the end of secondary school, but also that at the end they were also allowed to choose more difficult courses for the last 2 years of secondary school. They tended to choose more mathematics, more high-level science courses, and at university they tended to choose courses with a higher earnings potential afterwards. And one of the studies focus only on the kind of what they do is that they compare the kids who are just above the threshold and those who are just below. So you're comparing very similar kids. One of the studies also showed that used a methodology could look at more kids from a wider range of ability distribution. And what they found was that there was a significant positive impact among everybody, but this impact, who were allowed to go to the program, but the impact was much larger among the very best, the very top achievers. So it was kind of a linear interaction effect between your prior ability and your performance. There's another example is an American research, similar, or although it's not similar, it's for primary school, so it's slightly different, but it's a large-scale randomized experiment that was done in the last couple of years. And they also focus only on kids who were already subjected to some form of gifted education already. So they're providing a new type of gifted education, running the trial and seeing if there was an impact specifically in research skills and poetry. And there are differences, obviously, compared to that. And it's more structured, it's more formative assessment during the program, for example. Makes sense because it was in primary school. But the overall modules, the clear modules they call, are kind of the same have the same focus: enrichment and independent learning, and treatment generated much higher test score performance afterward. These studies are also backed up by smaller scale, older American randomized experiments that are a little bit less from the 80s and from the 90s, but there are a couple of them there. So overall, the conclusion I draw from this, that it's very difficult to draw conclusions because this body of the convincing research is very small. But the most promising avenues, at least reading from looking at this literature for gifted education, appears to be enrichment in combination with individualized learning. Now, that was difficult for me to accept. Having spent the last couple of years saying independent learning, discovery-based learning is crap. And I did that based on the general evidence and based on the literature as well, that overall, on average, these types of methods do not work. And but when we think about it, this is not necessarily a contradiction, because in fact it's supported by cognitive research, which suggests that experts do tend to perform better using discovery-based pedagogy. They already have the knowledge and information stored in their long-term memory, which they need in order to be solving problems. Novices, non-experts do not have this knowledge and information. They do not have these skills already. And the interesting thing is that I found some psychological literature suggesting that gifted children, in fact, tend to have characteristics required to benefit from this type of pedagogy. They are faster at information, they're faster at solving problems. They also are very good at transferring knowledge from the long-term memory with relative ease compared to other children. So it might not be such a contradiction here. But it is an important contrast with the general research on non-gifted children, among whom structured curricula and structured pedagogy have strong positive effects. And this is what more traditional style education, on average, among most children. And one example that's often discussed in the debate is direct instruction, which is often highlighted as strongly positive. There was a recent meta-analysis coming out in 2018 that got a lot of attention. because I think Dylan William tweeted about it. So, and I looked at that. That was an interesting, very interesting study. However, I do think that some of these researchers drew conclusions that were not really warranted about, not in that specific paper, but one of the authors generally writing about the importance of gifted education, or sorry, direct instruction, saying that this was also generalized to very able children. When I tried to look at the research and go through those papers, they were non-existent. There was one paper looking at very able children. Much of this research is focusing on very, very low performing children. Very low performing children. And in fact, the only study I did find was absolute, I mean, you couldn't draw any conclusion from that because, again, the methodology was so poor. And interestingly, one RCT that was available that they could have looked at, that was actually done on a more school-wide enrichment program that combined self-directed individualized learning in the afternoon with direct instruction in the morning. It was actually preferable among high-performing pupils compared with using direct instruction alone. And they did it, it was not only in the morning versus the afternoon, it was also kind of longer-term, shorter-term differential use. But interestingly, the same study suggested that in many cases, low-ability pupils did not benefit from that intervention. In fact, some evidence suggested that they lost out compared with the kids who only did direct instruction. So again, I'm just saying that my point with this slide is really to say my argument is not inconsistent with findings from the general literature. Okay. Couple of policy lessons for the future. So obviously, given the fact that we don't know that much, even though we have an inkling based on what I just told you. My main conclusion is that we need to advance more research in this field to find out really what works, and especially in the English context. We don't have any good research on this in the English context when it comes to this kind of methodological point that I made. So I would argue, one, given the importance of high-performing pupils for economic growth, perhaps especially because of Brexit, who knows? I think it's important would be interesting at least to discuss whether or not it's useful to fund the establishment of an independent organization similar to the Education Endowment Foundation that would run different trials, and we could test various things in the English context. Politically speaking, it's probably a complete no-go. But that's as a researcher, I think, given the lack of research and given their importance, I do think that could be it could be a good thing. And my review then suggested that one thing we should try more clearly and in different ways would be different types of independent learning and enrichment models for these kids. Also interesting is that while most of the research, or all the research that was rigorous comes from America and Europe, the findings that the research indicates, or for the programs that the research indicates work, also appear to be incorporated in some of the national programs in Asia for gifted education. In some of the countries that we often cite as having great education for everyone, but also for top achievers. And this includes Singapore specifically. I mean, in Singapore, all pupils are screened in year 3. They go through 2 tests, and then the top 1% of candidates attending enrichment programs with a stronger degree of independent learning and problem solving and these kind of things. And that's what they do. Now, there's absolutely no evidence that the Singaporean program works. I have to say that. It's just consistent, again, with the kind of ingredients in the research that found positive effects. So you definitely need to look much more into that as well. And that could be done perhaps through the trials that I mentioned. Also, we need a much more multi-pronged approach of identification to understand, to get around this problem of measurement error. And also the problem that in many cases, some kids are automatically losing out because they're not referred to these programs. So they tend to be ethnic minorities and kids from poor backgrounds because their parents do not refer them, their teachers do not refer them. And research has shown that that universal screening can increase the probability of attending some of these programs if you're from a poor disadvantaged background in a good way. Similar things with local norms of giftedness. So instead of having a national norm, I was going to say a cutoff at 25th percentile nationally, you have local norms. So maybe the 15% best, the 10% best, the 3% best, I don't know, it depends, of the school or in the school should be able to attend. Several metrics. So if you have more metrics, you will decrease the measurement error. Doesn't have to be test-based. So a new way to assess suitability for these programs is actually to let all children, for a limited period of time, go through this curriculum and go through the gifted education program. And then after a couple of months, you see, okay, the teachers assess who are most likely to benefit and who are most seem to be do not benefit. And then you assess it. Similar thing with reassessment over time. This is absolutely crucial. All of this is not going to solve the problem identification. That's important to understand. It's not going to solve it, but it can decrease the problem. But I would still argue that given this institutional framework, if we set it up, you could also use that to run trials in this respect. Again, maybe not politically possible, but I think that would be good. Finally, just quick conclusions. Important to devise public policy to maximize gifted children's potential. Okay, we established that. But most research is unfortunately not strong enough to be able, for us to be able to identify how we can do so. But the most convincing research suggests that we should use these kind of mumbo-jumbo methods, perhaps, if you want to call them that, combining at least enrichment with more independent learning. These are also characteristics that appear to be included in some of the Asian countries. It's not only Singapore, by the way, but maybe South Korea and Hong Kong. They differ from Japan and China quite significantly. I discussed that in the paper. But again, it's far from this straightforward to identify gifted pupils. Possible to improve our ability to do so. And the most important policy lessons that I draw from all of this is that we need better evidence. We need more trials to identify the gifted education programs that work, and also ways to identify gifted children on a smaller scale, preferably through an independent organization. And such an evidence-based approach hopefully would allow us to draw much more robust policy conclusions than I am able to do for you today. Thank you. Do I sit here?
You can sit there now if you like.
Oh no, she's going to speak, right?
Jeffrey's going to speak next.
Okay.
Okay.
Ah, okay. The clicker, yes.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that, Gabriel. And hello, everybody. For me, it was a bit of a Groundhog Day kind of experience. In 1978, when I first started working in this field, actually, the recommendations from research at that time that a combination of enrichment and individualized independent learning was what was being recommended.
But that's not the main solution. That's not the main recommendation, is it?
So it is kind of interesting that some things, what comes around again. I wanted to start here by saying that, without a shadow of doubt, this has been an issue in the English education system for over 40 years. Ofsted and its predecessors, HMI, have consistently said that that our system in England finds it difficult to challenge the more able students, is the term that they have used, although latterly higher attainable students. And it's still an issue in the way that you quoted, Gabriel. I want to ask this question: why do people think it matters? And the usual types of reasons are similar to the ones that you quote, which are economic and social implications. So the usual kind of stuff around high-performing pupils contributing disproportionately to economic wealth, but also research around people being healthier, wealthier, and more engaged citizens if they are high-performing. But I want to say at this point that high-performing and gifted are not synonymous terms. So there are high-performing people who have been defined as gifted, and there are high-performing people who have never been defined as gifted and would never describe themselves as gifted. And similarly, there are gifted people who perform highly and gifted people who do not. So to use the terms interchangeably is unhelpful in my view. But without putting that aside for a moment, it neatly sums up the situation as Chester Finn and Brendan Wright in 2015 from Washington's prestigious Fordham Institute said, the United States does not produce enough outstanding students, and students from disadvantaged backgrounds are severely underrepresented amongst those high flyers. So that's the kind of problem that is particularly in the American and Western canon of research. So if it is this important and long-standing systemic problem, you'd think we might have made more progress towards solving it. And what I can say, I'm afraid, was from my experience and the research that I've undertaken over a long period of time, is the kinds of suggestions you're making are unlikely to get us much further forward. They won't solve the problems, and to understand why not, you have to engage with a kind of broader set of factors. So it's really interesting to note that nowhere in the world is there comprehensive policy on gifted education that is of long standing. So there have been flurries of activity where this has been introduced in a comprehensive fashion in different countries in the world over time. And they're as diverse as Thailand and England, Israel and the US. But they've all been eventually dropped. There is some government provision in a handful of countries, but overall, as you have articulated so well, Gabriel, the picture is one of piecemeal, largely ineffective, under-researched provision, and very little funded research. And one of the reasons why funded research doesn't appear to be prevalent internationally is because much of the provision that's made is made through charitable foundations and other forms of private enterprise, where investigating the research is something which is not the highest of their priorities. But it is interesting, and we can't kind of put it aside, this idea that various countries have tried comprehensive policy and nowhere has it endured. Is that a matter of coincidence? Why does it not endure, and what does, if anything, does research tell us about that? Well, I guess I just want to sort of say that in 2008, I was commissioned to do a major meta-analysis for Taylor and Francis around gifted education and the last 30 years in gifted education. And this is compiled into a 4-volume set, of which it looks at the way in which this field has developed. And there are kind of 4 major themes that have emerged, and what they do is they tell us a little bit about why this is in the state that it's in. So the 4 major themes that have emerged are around conceptions of giftedness, identification, education provision, and education policy. And I would say the research based on 1 and 2 about conceptions of giftedness and identification there is a significant body of research, but there is very little consensus. So in terms of conceptions of giftedness, they're fragmented over time. And in terms of identification, you've begun to highlight some of the issues and dilemmas around that. On the 3rd category of education provision, there is meagre and poor quality research. Less than 20% of papers at G&T conferences were actually research-based at all, let alone empirically-based in terms of research. So it's mostly small-scale, qualitative, and there's short duration. And on the question of research in terms of education policy, I could find none of any significance. So let's go back to why we're not making more progress. And it seems to me there are certain reasons behind this. The first is that there are different ways to think about gifted education. So very early on, people thought about this as just being about very unique individuals. But in the last half century, mostly it's been this approach called the cohort paradigm. And that's when Gabriel's referring to gifted education in the document that you're producing. That's the paradigm where you've looked at the research and you have looked at what has come out from research in that paradigm. What's usually talked about as gifted education relates to this cohort approach, and it's been the main approach in the US and the West for the last 50 years. And the US have led the way in terms of scale and and significant. It's based on the idea that gifted education is directed at a targeted, definable subset of the population who have common and clearly definable educational needs, and that those differ from the general populace. None of that is really, we have not got an evidence base that would say that we could be secure about that, okay? And what I found when I was undertaking my meta-analysis was that this particular paradigm is in the decline for a variety of reasons, and that the alternative kind of idea of building human capital is more in the ascendancy. And in fact, you know, some of the big researchers in the US who've been researching in the cohort paradigm, like Borland, actually describes the concept of giftedness as being incoherent and untenable. So there's a real challenge to it as an idea. So the kind of why is there? What's the general problems around that? Well, as I've mentioned, there's no consensus on definition. We don't know whether it's general intelligence, or different people have different views about whether it's general intelligence or whether it's multidimensional. There's no agreement about whether it's domain specific. So whether you're gifted in a particular subject or whether you're generally gifted. There's no agreement about whether we're talking about your current level of attainment, so you're performing at an advanced level, or whether we're talking about the potential that you have, which may lead to performance. And again, there's no agreement about whether it's cognitive domains alone, or as Gabriel mentions in the UK, what's called talented is not called that anywhere else in the world, which is art, sport, and music. So there's not much consensus around. And that's why definition of a cohort is inherently problematic as well as unreliable, because it's what are you identifying against? What is it you're trying to identify? The lack of agreement there is problematic. So there are other reasons why the cohort paradigm is in decline, though, from a policy perspective. And it's worth thinking about that too. So the first is, it by its nature puts a number on the percentage of people who can perform highly, as does all selection. So if what you want is more, if the driver behind this at a policy level is to have more high performing students, you may be ill-advised to put a cap on how many you can have, okay? The second reason why, from a policy perspective, it tends to be unpopular is that there is quite a lot of research to suggest, not just in gifted education, but in selection generally, although there's some in gifted education, that it is the case that it compounds social mobility problems. So in terms of selection generally, it's generally been found by, for example, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, that selective education is found to widen educational inequality. That is,
they do that, but it's
Sibieta, 2017. Yeah. So, and in this sort of international research on gifted education, there is research, and I agree with what you're saying about it's very difficult to make judgments because the research is not as strong as it should be. But on average, people are 5 times more likely to be selected for gifted programs across the world if they come from an affluent indigenous part of the affluent indigenous population. And even where schemes are created for particularly targeted at the disadvantaged, it doesn't always lead to the outcome that you might want, because some research, for example, RIE in 2004, suggests that it's the nature of the middle class norms that underpin those programs which alienate students from disadvantaged backgrounds, even if they've been placed in the program. So again, it's not a panacea. There's some problems around it. So the other points in relation to this that you might kind of pick up in terms of from a policy perspective, if you're a minister being asked to make policy, is that, you know, there's some of these things that we know a little bit about from other dimensions, which is that selection generally has been proven in some cases to have an adverse effect on the self-efficacy of those people not selected. So it might be beneficial for those people who are selected, but it may create depressed overall standards in terms of the non-selected. It can create, being selected into that kind of group can create problems with labelling and pressure. And obviously, well-being is a big issue for us in this country at the moment in terms of schools. So pressure is something to be thought about. Perhaps more significantly, it is based on the kind of fixed ability model, in which was very much part of the second half of the 20th century, whereas neuroscience is talking much more about neuroplasticity, and therefore the idea that we can determine in advance who's going to do well at a time when we know that the brain is essentially plastic is another reason why people are concerned about this matter. And then finally, just in general terms, I think it is disputed that they do things that are in any way different from anybody else. This is Shaw's meta-analysis. So he does say this bit, which you're saying, which is the novice to expert continuum. But I think it is the novice to expert continuum rather than being intrinsically different from a subset of people, or at least arguably that's one interpretation of the research. Yeah. So, but they're not always expert in everything.
No.
So perhaps thinking about where people are in the continuum to novice to expert is more helpful than thinking they are this type or that type of person. Anyway, I want to conclude by saying that top performing systems tend to be focusing instead on this kind of idea of development rather than selection. So if we kind of reverse the situation, we need more high performing people. And so is having a gifted education program the best way to get it? I would suggest probably not. There's only 2 of the top 10 performers in the OECD PISA tables that have gifted education as part of their offer at all. And the others all have a large percentage of high-performing students, including those from disadvantaged backgrounds, even in the absence of it. The 2 that do have it, which is Hong Kong and Singapore, do have such policy, but they don't have, as you mentioned, any serious research into effectiveness. They do actually have some research into effectiveness, and that's but it's not in the public domain. They tend not to publish in that kind of way. But it is interesting that, for example, in Hong Kong, the base school curriculum has a set of textbooks that people have to use, and that in itself is really knowledge-rich and demanding, and the expectations are universally high. So it may be that the base curriculum is part of what's arguably, I'm just putting this as a possibility, as a different explanation. So I would say that the trend globally is away from the idea of gifted education programs and towards more demanding education, particularly more demanding curricula. And so probably looking more deeply and more intensively at cognition and domain knowledge and skills is a helpful area for further study. I think EEF are doing some both lit reviews and blind trials on different types of cognitive interventions, and it's a bit of a blunt instrument, but I think it's useful. And actually, Ofsted itself is examining curriculum. So in summary, I think that a better next step would be to consider what research tells us about high-performing systems and high-performing schools, which is also an inadequately researched area. But as I said when I wrote a policy paper in 2010, there definitely is room at the top for more people to do well, and I don't want to limit that.
Good, okay. So what we'll do is, can I ask both of you to keep your remarks to 5 minutes, and we're going to cut substantially your time for concluding remarks and feature the floor for the last one. We're going to go over into drinks time. Really standard, by 10 minutes, but I know you will be very interested in getting to the end of the line when we hear from Daniel about what Ofsted's making some predictions. I was told you were going to be speaking on behalf in your official capacity, but you better make that clear or not at the beginning of the your contribution, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. So, very important you've undertaken this work. It's very timely. Always very, very interesting to hear your overall analysis, Deborah. Agree with almost all of it, and the bits I don't, I feel uncomfortable about, are just the grounds for an interesting further discussion rather than fundamental disagreement, I think. I want to be very quick, James, and I just want to add the things that I think would usefully take the discussion and the policy activity further forward, rather than rehearsing or contesting some of the other points. This is an area, of course, where it's massively confounded by the context of schooling, by opportunity to learn, as Bill Schmidt calls it, which is so differential in different systems. You can't be good at something that you've not been exposed to. And so a lot of this is characterised by issues around OTL. What I want to very briefly focus on, James, is the nature of the discourse, the landscape for action in the light of that discourse. So as a measurement expert, let's face it, individuals, when you measure them on anything, you get a scale. You get differential performance. You get different differential performance at different ages. And what you do with that is fundamental. And in many ways, its debate is conditioned by that fundamental insight into the characteristic of the human condition as you age, grow, and development. What I want to very briefly do is just look at the grounds on which we could make progress in this area. I think your historical insight, which I think is absolutely right, having looked at the history of a very wide range of high-performing, poor-performing systems, is one of a very poorly sustained policy practice in this area. And there's got to be something in that. I think one of the things that we need to be aware of is the nature of the discourse around the policy and the research. Okay, so essentially, we have a whole series of societies, including our own, where we're vaguely uncomfortable and slightly embarrassed when we're doing something around this, and uncomfortable and vaguely embarrassed when we're not. And if you look at the policy statements and the reaction to action, gift and talented programs and so on, that's the state of affairs. We've got to make progress, surely. Otherwise, we will continue to act and waste money, or not act and actually fail to respond to the needs of both individuals and groups. So what's the nature of the discourse? Okay, so as is so frequently the case in education, people argue, and it looks as though they're arguing about the same thing, but they're actually arguing on completely different grounds. So let's just look at some of those. You'll have people claiming that it's the impact on the individual that we need to pay most attention to. And they will be shouted down by people that it's the impact on others that we need to be most concerned about, of actually acting or not acting. The specific benefits associated with focusing on individuals versus collateral impact on schooling more generally, the learning culture, the social stigmatization that is associated with those who would be characterized as being lower performing. We've got the value of these outcomes associated with individuals and what they can achieve, and the value of these outcomes associated with programs devoted more generally to raising the attainment of a large segments of society. Maximizing potential of individuals versus the divisive effects and the impact on social values that actually responding to those needs actually has. And the characteristics of individuals versus the characteristics of the learning environment in which they find themselves. Now, those I think we need to confront, because that is the nature of a fractured, very angry set of exchanges, which I think prevent us from moving forward systematically through the research, putting things in place which we can measure appropriately in order to reach conclusions about action. Just to finish, when we look at these distributions, when we look at the things that stand out in schools, and we can do that, we can look at the individual whose GCSE results rise above the GCSE results of all the other kids in that particular school. What do we find? We do find some characteristics of those individuals which are peculiar. Sometimes they do relate to their physiology, as well as the environment in which they've been raised. We certainly find features associated with special support, a particular set of relationships which that individual has with teachers or with others around them, hot housing effects, and so on. So we know there's difference in human populations. We know there are differences in the learning environments. We do know that those give rise to better progression or suppressed progression. My problem is that we're bogged down in the debate, which is characterized by these kind of false understandings and false oppositions. And therefore your call to make progress will be bogged down until we understand the characteristics of our debate.
Good, thank you.
Okay, so I'm also going to keep it short. I promise that.
And are you speaking as Daniel, free and liberated, or are you speaking as...
As a member of Offset, I am never free and liberated. but yeah, these are my personal views, and I'm going to mainly kind of, I think you...
Even better.
Well, I think you have a fundamental problem here in terms of looking at this question of how can we move this field forward, how can we really look at the impact of this. And I think it's a fundamental problem that is not limited to research on gifted education. I think it's a fundamental problem that we see in a lot of areas of educational research, which is that to research something properly, you first have to have some agreement on what it is that you're actually looking at. And in gifted education, and in many other areas of educational research as well, we simply do not have agreement about the concepts that are fundamental to what we are actually studying. What is giftedness? There is no agreement, as Deborah mentioned, about that in the field at all. You see, and even in the papers that you review, you have some papers that take very much a position on making giftedness almost a synonym of high attainment, and there are problems with that. And then you also cite somebody like Renzulli, who has a much more holistic view of giftedness, and that makes it very hard ever to move forward with the field. So I think if you are going to look at developing research in this area, first has to be some consensus on what you're looking for. As I say, this is a problem across many areas of education, and it's interesting when you look at some of the areas where it has been possible to form a consensus around key concepts, how much more quickly the research base evolves and how much more high quality research there consequently appears. And an example I like to mention there is research on self-concept, not an entirely unrelated thing, in the sense that it's a social psychological variable, which in itself could give rise to a whole range of interpretations. But at some point in the early 1980s, quite a strong consensus emerged on what it was, how it's defined, and how it's measured. And you can therefore see that in terms of the whole area of, say, social and emotional constructs related to learning, is probably the one where we have by far the best evidence base, because that agreement just allows you to build and develop the field in a programmatic way, in a way that we actually build on previous research instead of constantly finding new things, new measures. And again, that's a really unhelpful thing we see in this field, in other areas of education. We keep finding new measures of things. Again, how are we actually going to come to an evidence base that actually builds on and it constructs on what already exists? So that's one thing. I think if we don't get to the bottom of that, then we are not going to progress. Obviously, of course, entirely related to that is then this big issue of identification. If you don't know what it is, how then are you going to effectively identify it in the first place? How are you actually going to measure impact, even if you do? So in the studies that you mentioned, the Dutch and the American study, okay, they basically look at kind of top group of performers in schools and look at the impact of a program. But there are, again, big problems here, especially in this kind of field, because you have the question, what is causing this effect? Is it the intervention, or is it the identification itself and the labeling that goes along with that? So that's, and you may dismiss that, but we know there's a lot of research out there on the importance of expectations, and also what that will mean in terms of potentially the home learning environment and how parents react to that, etc. So it's not an easy area to research, it's not an easy area to do a synthesis on. I did find it very interesting that you, like previous research, find those particular approaches to look more promising. I would say that in theoretical terms, that makes a lot of sense with regards to the expert notice reversal effect. I would say, and that obviously strengthens the argument that it is hard to say that is a preferred style or way of teaching that we should applicate everywhere. We should make sure that what we do is fit to the purpose, to the students, to the curriculum area that we're looking at. But I would also say that because it's only 2 studies, it's studies which have some issues methodologically. As an evidence base, it's not very convincing. So it would certainly not be something I would want to base a policy on, certainly not something we would want to base an inspection on.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Daniel. Right, okay, we're going to have, I'm ringing for some reason. Any experts know why I'm ringing? Right, we're going to go to the floor now and make the most of the time that we have. Thank you for your patience. I'm sure people are dying to say all sorts of things. So we're going to try and get as many people to chance to get the word in as possible. So can we start here? Can you keep say who you are, please, introduce yourself.
I'm Charlotte Davis. I'm from Fit to Learn. We're a social enterprise in Croydon. We are passionately keen to make our young very fit to learn. And we've heard very usefully about neuroplasticity. We change people because people are desperate to change. It's lovely, all this lovely research. I'm sure it's even very busy, but actually we have to change real people. And in order for me to change real people, they have to have good motor skills development, they have to have good binocular vision, they've got to have good sound processing, or the messages going from body to brain don't work. And I need to see research in that area, and are we ever going to see that kind of sense of research?
Thank you. I'm sorry, your first name?
Charlotte.
Yes, and you're from?
From Educate.
Okay.
Is there any research in top performing pupils that use with the different assessment methods, using maybe IB, different assessment methods, even by discipline?
Okay. Any further questions to add to that? Want a couple more, please? Yes. Your name is?
Question. I think it's probably
your name is, sorry?
My name is Tim Francis.
Hi, Tim.
I'm a child and educational psychologist.
Okay, great.
It's more of an observation. And I think that, you might sort of try these programs, but what's going on is the middle class parents are all running gifted and talented programs anyway, aren't they? We all are, aren't we? And we're all interfering with research.
Okay. Yes,
Not
and
in
this
the
lady
randomised,
here.
you're not.
This lady here.
I'm Harriet from Cohort Small Achievers. So
Hello, Harriet. Nice to
very
meet you.
pleased to be here. So we're a primary aged enrichment program offering workshops to children with high learning potential. My question, or more of a point about whether any research has picked up the learning loss that children experience between primary and secondary school. And particularly we're interested in disadvantaged children and how quickly either social stigmatization or a change in curriculum or the huge change that everyone goes through when they go through a transition like that just sees learning tail off.
Okay.
Yeah.
Some quick responses. Tim, do you want to speak to that last question first?
Okay, yes. When I was at QCA, I was at Cambridge, I was at QCA until 2006, from its inception in 1997 to 2006. We sat on a course to look great up data from national testing, doing Key Stage 3 tests, and those were active in the system at the time. And there was something, of course, called Key Stage 3 dip, and I was very interested to investigate whether this was a function so it was apparent in a wide range of systems around the world, or whether it might be associated with some characteristics of our own system. Barry Creasy and my team actually did some very, very good work on this, and we investigated a series of projects, including one from NFER. What was very interesting, despite the lack of equivalent data in other systems, some other systems got rely on teacher assessment, we could find the Key Stage 3 dip in a very wide variety of countries. And we were therefore interested in what they also attributed the Key Stage 3 dip to. At the time, there was very good work being done in Cambridge on transitions. So Jean Ruddock did very good work on transitions at the time. And we believe it can be attributed to maturational issues associated with the teenage brain. Now we've got pretty good research on that. The huge change of moving from an institution, a small institution, to a larger one, all the rules and others which go through that long list of things, combining at once to create Key Stage 3 dip. Some of those we can address through educational policy. I mean, I've spoken before about the fact that Key Stage 3 in some schools is a wilderness through which tumbleweeds grow, with no attention to children on an individual basis, other than looking at their Key Stage 2 results. It's bizarre. So I think we can act, and that would be a benefit to very many kids. By acting more generally, we might also be able to identify those who are falling dramatically behind in terms of potential, which was precocious, which was demonstrated in primary. We're doing very badly as a nation in terms of looking at Stage 3. It is still a very underdeveloped segment of the system, and it's troubled by this conjunction of effects, which seems to adversely affect educational progression during that time of pupils' development.
Danny, can I? There's a question here about parents and representative groups, national groups, muddying the waters further. If I could phrase the question slightly differently, what happens when? What have been some of the consequences of the lack of clarity about direction and identification of what it is that we're talking about, as you see it, for the wider landscape of provision, and just, you know, how do we expect parents to react when experts stand up and say, well, frankly, we really just don't know.
Well, I mean,
I'd just be interested in your response to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely an issue, and of course, as you rightly point out, parents themselves intervene extensively in this area and provide all kinds of support for pupils. I think that is actually a major issue in terms of the research we do, and I come from the area of school effectiveness research, and probably one of the hidden aspects that we don't take into account is the impact of not so much parental background in itself, but parental tutoring use. So if we see that in a particular school or context kids are doing particularly well, is that the school or is that the private tutors that certainly middle-class parents tend to buy in? That's also a big problem when you look at the international studies. We always talk about these high-performing countries, but what is the cause there? Is that because their schools are so good, or is that because when you go to Singapore and you go into a bookshop, like a third of the floor space is given over to test preparation books from year 3 to 21-year-olds, or is that because when you go to Seoul, you have police checking that the private schools shut at midnight and will not keep the kids up all night. So and not only at the so much. So we have a number of different issues here. How would you react as a parent? I think it's entirely natural that parents take their own initiative and do what they think is best for their kids. Whatever we may say about identification of giftedness, that doesn't really matter to parents. What parents do is possible outcomes for their own kids, as any parent would. Does it matter whether my kid is identified or not? No, it only matters if identification has consequences, i.e. I get put into enrichment programs. What you will then see, and this is one of the problems I think when you're talking about these screening programs, is once you start introducing screening methods that seem to give your kid a particular advantage over others. Watch the tutoring industry pick up on that very quickly, and once again you'll have the conflation of what is the impact of the child and what is the impact of what the parents can put in terms of those goals and so on.
Great, thank you. Deborah, Gabriel, do you have anything to add to those comments?
On the IB, the
Quite
assessment,
similar,
the answer is no. There's very little evidence in general of that. And rigorous evidence, I mean, we're talking about all these problems that they mentioned here, by the way. You could say the same thing about education in general, as you highlighted, everything has been highlighted. Problem I mean, it's only in the past 10, 15, 20 years which people, I mean, quite frankly, economists have revolutionized the field to a large extent, that we got a little bit closer. And you mentioned some of these studies that it is so politically charged as well. So this is the problem, that when I'm talking, I mean, look, I absolutely agree. I would never build a national policy on those two papers that I mentioned. But it was more for the indication. But if you look at everything, you could say the same thing about any trial. Will there be an impact of, you'll be part of the trial? Look at the EF. How much do they find? What are the effects of the Education Endowment Foundations? Often zero. And that's also advancement. And I have to say, when it comes to selection here on the issue of social mobility, that research isn't very good. And I work with some of them doing them. So I'm just saying it's not causal. And I've read the review that you mentioned, but looking at the papers, which I cite in my paper, there's very little evidence they actually make a difference, on average, even for the kids who attend them.
Yeah.
And this is important because if it doesn't, how would it affect social mobility? And this is the best research we do have, okay? So just highlighting, there is evidence, which we never talk about, that selective systems and selective schools, when you have that system, it increases performance already among the pupils who compete. Because competition among pupils have been shown to have positive effects. So what you do in that system, that may not necessarily have long-lasting effects. It may be negative for the other reasons that you divide them up into social segregation anyway. But it's just important that that research is barely mentioned in the debate, partly again, I think, for political reasons. So my concluding remarks is that I agree with all of you when it comes to these problems, but most of them are not specific to this specific field in education. And my conclusion is we need more research in this issue. It doesn't mean that we should set up a national program of a specific thing. I never advocate that either. So that's all I have to say about it.
Very quickly. So this issue of competition between children and the spread of attainment and the extent to which you can put children onto a rank order.
Yeah.
There is some very uncomfortable evidence, which people would find very uncomfortable in England from Hong Kong, that if you place all the children in your system on a rank order, they all try to climb over each other. There's still some at the bottom, but the whole distribution is up. Very interesting.
Right.
I want to pick up also briefly the issue about parents, because there is a kind of, not necessarily in what you're saying, but there is in many contexts in which this issue is raised, it's a notion that a parental interest in their children's education always is of the same form. And of course it differs dramatically, both within societies and certainly between nations. In Sweden, a great deal of parental engagement with children, it results in children going to easier schools.
Yeah.
In Hong Kong and Shanghai, precisely the reverse. So the nature of engagement and the values which drive it and specific outcomes vary hugely, as well as the level of parental engagement.
Okay, thank you. Further comments? Burning questions? Who's getting triggered? Yes, go on. Your name is?
I just wanted to continue the conversation about parents, because, by the way, I'm Miranda Tema, and I come from ELIC, and education improvement as far as that, responsible for almost every MQT, so ethnic minorities. And I've met quite a lot of parents, worried parents, about their children who are able. And luckily they had identified them because they had friends, either teaching in university or specialists in this field or that field. And the school had failed to identify them, and therefore they provided for them. So I can understand their point of view, trying to do something, because some schools do not do that. And also the concept of inclusion, providing everything in the classroom is fantastic in a way, but it doesn't work all the time. They would have to have extra things to have some support in terms of achieving their full potential. Yes, for those programs, maybe other children might benefit, because obviously we have to cater for everybody. So therefore, I will link this also with the research focusing also on what's happening actually within the teaching, because I know I'm responsible for IQTs as well. And I can see they are so unprepared for the world of gifted education. But also talented, also more experienced teachers struggle to provide for these children. They always say, oh, can we give them extra? No, you don't give them extra. It's about extending them. It's about all the high quality questions that you ask, plus other things. So is the research going to look at, in any research, to look at what is the best teaching practice? Because we know, for example, Shanghai mathematics or Singapore mathematics, they are working in London.
Yeah.
Because
Yes,
they start from, the bar is here.
Yeah, but they do work, but if you look at it, what's the impact of 1 year of teaching Shanghai mathematics? A couple of PISA points in England. So when you transfer the great mathematics teaching from Singapore to England, all you get is a couple of more PISA points. Well, at least 1 year. So it is important to sorry.
Right. Yes.
So, as far as classrooms are concerned, most of the research into classrooms generally suggests that there are three factors which are fundamentally underpin most of this. It is about what is taught, so curriculum, how it's taught, and the level of expectations. So in terms of transition points, that is why transition crops up all the time. Not just in Key Stage 3, although I recognise exactly what it's saying around Key Stage 3, but in research terms, transition points generally cause a fracturing in terms of expectations, and sometimes a fracturing in terms of curriculum. So those three factors are fundamentally just underpin teaching and learning in the classroom environment. And I just wanted to say something about, I've spent a lot of time in Hong Kong, and I think it is really interesting that when you kind of look at this whole question of what makes, we tend to have the stereotype of, Hong Kong, Singapore, Shanghai, wherever it is, working like crazy and doing extra tutoring and all that kind of thing. But the kind of Confucius tradition in education, which sits underneath all of this, it fundamentally says that, if you go along and you work hard, you will be rewarded for that. And therefore, there's an expectation amongst those students that will be the outcome, rather than, if I could put this, and I'm going to just create a dichotomy with the US, which is at the other end of the continuum, which has a very different tradition of education, in which it's saying, well, what we need to do is diagnose what kind of a person you are before we start, and then give you a diet that's appropriate for you. Those two things are radically different. Yes. And I agree with what you're saying about the research can generally, many of these things can be applied, and the point I'm going to make is also one that can be applied generally, which is that the research cannot stand separate from the context in relation to.
But in this specific instance, it is. So when it comes to the Shanghai math, just to point that, you took something from one context and transplanted it to another context and saw what happened in a randomized study. John Jerry was on that paper in the Economics Education Review, and they found a couple of PISA points. But it wasn't necessary to transform England into Shanghai. So this is again, when it comes to teaching methods, to answer your question on the teaching methods, that type of method is the best. Strict traditional teaching works for most kids, and especially disadvantaged children. We have good randomized evidence from that in America and kids' schools.
But
okay.
are adapting, they are not taking that as it is. So that's important.
Okay, sure.
Thank you, Jane. Tim Knox, I'm a trustee of the Politics and Economics Research Trust, which funded this project. So we're very grateful to Gabriel and James and panelists for all their wisdom and insight. I hope the following comment isn't considered as being too facetious, but if one takes a very long historical view, then Britain has actually had a very long record of educating the gifted and talented children, and that is the original cause of the great public schools, which were all originally set up to educate the very poor but talented children who it was thought would benefit both the church and the nation through education programs. It's of course true that their example does show the great power of middle class or perhaps upper class capture, in that they've all now come quite a long way from their original remit.
Yes.
But equally, it might be the case that their example does suggest maybe that they've had some success in both improving the environment for education all children.
So, can I respond to that? So, British education as an education export is the envy of the world, because when British education is done well, that's what everybody else wants to emulate. The difficulty that we have had as a country is getting that level of consistency across our system, and it remains an issue for us. But those top schools, by and large, I mean, some of them are selective on entry, but by and large, they are providing the characteristics which I was talking about, which is high expectations, demanding curriculum, taught in a Socratic kind of way, which brings some kind of engagement. So they do all of the pieces that you need in terms of executive functioning to get to, in terms of working memory, those kinds of things at the novice stage, that they move as fast as they can into the more investigative problematizing of material. And yes, so we have it on hand. We know what it looks like. We know we only have to go kind of up the road to find it. Our problem is that we have been unable to generalize that across the system, and we've tried in many ways.
Yes, but for many reasons that are not associated with some notion of that not being applicable to other educational settings. And that's absolutely fundamental. That's why it's so important to emphasise the Confucian model, which exists in these other systems. Can I link back to the original question, which Charlotte's actually raised? Because I think when you express very, very modestly your concern for having found that PBL does work, in combination with more traditional pedagogy at some of these studies. PBL, problem-based
jumble method.
Yeah. You know, there is an explanation for that in emergent neuroscience, Kurt Fisher's work. And it's entirely consistent with the notion of direct instruction, the acquisition of cognitive resources. You need them in order to use them flexibly to solve unanticipated problems in unfamiliar contexts. And the more you have progressed through a whole series of foundational knowledge and foundational concepts, the more able you will be able to rapidly benefit from these more contextualized learning settings. You know, it's there in Kurt Fisher's work, and it progresses, helpfully, it progresses through life. You know, Kurt Fisher's, the oldest age group we looked at was 28, and they were still elaborating and further developing this facility. Completely contrary to Piaget, very promising in terms of human development. Where I think we do need to go back to what you were suggesting, Charlotte, in terms of some fundamentals of executive function and other aspects of language, there is a research base at Zero Neurons and Jazz in terms of learning to write gives you much more than what's on page. It gives you psychomotor development, it transforms the structure of your brain. The work of Kathy Silver and Brendan Taggart, and Jane Melanie to Theobald, and Susan Greenfield's work, which completely corroborates with Kurt Fisher.
I never doubt the existence of the research in physiology and behavioural optometry.
Yeah.
So I can reorganise anybody who's in front of me, make them efficient, high skill, external. I'm actually worried that some of what I'm hearing is quite dangerous, and that there's all this work going on, but without understanding really the precise physiology of the students in front of you. I mean, I think all of the EAF research is rubbish, because they've no idea how efficient those learners are. And if you don't know that, it makes it
I'm going to pause you. Yeah, we're going to go off topic again, but let's, sorry, we've got 1 minute left.
We've talked a little bit about definitions of digital learning. Can I just shift it slightly and just ask a comment on taking a student-centered approach to this topic, which is, for example, is there any comment you can make on how non-stretched certain high-achieving students feel, and what can be done about that non-stretchedness?
So, well, the research is that if students feel they're insufficiently challenged in their environment, they're bored and they become disruptive. And so it is the case that higher performing students are more likely to find that in some context they find the percentage of time that they're not challenged is greater, and that is not a good place to be. In terms of what can you do about it, well, you can come at it from both sides of the continuum, can't you? So one side is about looking at how you create greater levels of challenge as a matter of course in teaching. And I have a colleague who says that every teacher in the world says that high expectations are important, and she's never met one that says that she's got low expectations. But they are there. So it's relative. What do I mean when I say something is a high expectation? In relation to that, but there are also strategies that in the canon of the paradigm of cohort, the cohort paradigm of gifted education, and some of the qualitative studies that have been done, particularly in the US, they have looked at the kind of coping strategies that students have for dealing with that, and basically making a better fist out of an inadequate opportunity. So you want to improve the opportunities. But if the opportunities are not optimum, some work has been done on the possible effectiveness of students becoming better at exploiting weak opportunities.
But isn't that what we should be doing?
Well, but Daniel also highlighted the issue of learning identity, and I think it's fundamental. And we know that there are a whole series of issues in English education, the recent work in the Southwest, where children themselves find a passive and quiet place to hide to avoid the punitive action of their peers, as well as in some cases the punitive action of the school in relationship to those who are falling into the kind of categories that we're talking.
Can I say one thing?
Yes, go on.
Hassan. To me, it comes down to leadership and management. How come there's one school that does well and supports the children that are gifted or able to perform well, and another school next door that can't do it? I think that people need to understand, the leaders need to have really in-depth knowledge of all their children and be able to give them the opportunities and the excitement and experiences that they need, and then take it further by working with the whole community, etc., etc. Just as an ordinary head teacher.
Thank you for that. Don't say just as an ordinary head teacher.
Well,
okay. So thank you all very much. I'm sure your time is running, but I would just like to acknowledge our sponsor in conclusion. We're very grateful to the Political and Economic Research Trust for the grant that made this project possible. We do hope to continue our work with you to drill down further into these and related issues. And also to remember Coram tomorrow's achievers, whose we've read the note in the programme, but it was Coram's work that the founder of and trustees of the Political and Economics Research Trust was so inspired by, which motivated them to want to investigate this area further and see what could be done to support their good work. So accordingly, research is dedicated to them. So thank you to Tim and Bob and your colleagues on the board of the trust. And thank you all again for coming. And now thank you to our speakers. I must say, I'm the person involved in this by my overly long introductions, but then we have the privilege this evening to have real experts among us, and so I only half apologise for that. I hope you'll agree with me. It's been there are drinks in the other room, and there's also food.
Really?
Yes.